Paula, welcome back. Welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. Pleasure to talk to you again. And I think we're going to have a great conversation about your adventures in the Ukraine. But first and foremost, welcome back.
Thank you, Ben. It's really nice to see someone again. It's a little bit more comfortable, isn't it, to dive in with these conversations?
It's always a bit easier. Before we dive into your latest adventures, though, and for the people who may not have caught our first episode together, it would be useful if you maybe just give a little bit of a background to who you are and what you do. I think that'd be a great place to start.
Yeah, sure. I shall do a short version. So I am an adventurer and a psychologist, and I also double up with those, and I am an adventure psychologist. So adventuring wise, I've skied to the South Pole, I've sailed around the world, I've cycled across 17 countries, I've climbed some mountains and paddled some rivers, and I love trekking in the jungle especially. Last year, I was also volunteering and delivering humanitarian aid in Ukraine, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And then in 2018, I graduated with a master's in applied positive psychology. And in that, I studied adventure and the benefits and purpose of going on an expedition. So since then, I've been banging my drum about adventure psychology, which I describe as how to survive, cope and thrive challenging times.
Awesome. I was going to just ask you about what you mean by adventure psychology. And it seems like this is something that we need more and more, right? Uncertain times all around us, all among us. And we probably need to reframe it a little bit. So before we dive into your adventures in the Ukraine, could you just describe a little bit more about what you mean by adventure psychology? And I know you've written a whole book about it, but maybe if we just tee this up a little bit with how to think about uncertainty and adopt, as you say, an adventure psychology or adventure mindset, or however you want to describe it.
Yeah, sure. It really should be life psychology, to be honest, because I call it adventure, and adventure has its elements of toughness and adversity and challenge, but actually it's kind of how to survive life psychology, really. It's the journey that we're on and how to stay as healthy as possible. So there's the sort of psychological well-being and how to maintain that over time. But that, of course, also affects our physical well-being and vice versa. So it's really how to survive and cope and thrive the ups and downs of a journey. And I quite often compare it with sports psychology, Ben, because it's quite easy to compare and contrast. So, and people are fairly familiar with sports psychology, which is like a performance psychology. So like sport, it's about performance, and there's a lot of physical aspects included in it, and about performing well, maybe being at our optimal fitness for it. But unlike sports, it's a much longer commitment and evolution of time, but also the endurance of time is very much part of it. So it is about optimal performance, not peak performance. So how do we perform at our best in the conditions and context and circumstances? How to deal with uncertainty, as you said. So ambiguity, uncertainty, not knowing what's around the corner. How to cope with change and variability. So the weather or the climate can change the way we are experiencing the world. The mindset, as you said, a lot about fear and courage. And that for me very much links into risk, which I know your podcast is about. So fear, courage, failure, quitting, when to carry on, risk management, risk awareness. There's a lot there. So essentially it's endurance. It's a much longer preparation and awareness and well-being, but whilst also suffering and struggling quite often with the harder times, which quite often does include uncertainty and how to deal with that. So you're right. We really need this. We all need it in this day and age because we are dealing with a lot of difficult times, and we have to learn coping skills, basically, how to adapt and how to cope.
I I love that definition. And I also like the distinction between adventure psychology and sports psychology. I really like sports psychology. I can't get enough of it. I listen to so many podcasts and things about it. But if you're thinking about, a sport, then there's a structure around it, right? Like there are rules. There are maybe some specific things that a sports person might be trying to do, whether that's to serve a tennis ball or throw or kick a penalty kick or shoot a free throw or, what have you. Whereas adventure psychology, the rules of there are not as many rules, that there's less structure around it. It's kind of almost never ending or infinite. And I really like the distinction that you make there, because arguably there's more in common between adventure psychology and life than maybe sports psychology.
Yeah, and I think it's more accessible and more relatable, I suppose, because so many people, I think, are ostracized by sport, because we're used to seeing the peak athletes at peak fitness competing in peak Olympics, like there's one this year, isn't there? So it's admirable, and I also really enjoy it. I love sport. I love the sports and find fascinating our ability to perform and be strong and capable and skilled. But there's the other stuff outside of that, and that's where I think we can apply it much more to life. And just dealing with uncertainty. People don't enjoy ambiguity and uncertainty. They kind of hate it. So even just tolerance or acceptance are massive parts of being on an adventure. To be able to tolerate pain or boredom, even quite often, or not knowing everything, not knowing how far to go, or things like that, where the end is. So tolerance and acceptance of life, of the ups and downs, they're huge. And I think some people, once you've got those two sort of licked, once you can mooch along and be present and accept and tolerate, then you can start to refine your performance and be a bit more strong and skilled about how to tackle the ups and downs.
Yeah. So, well, with that in mind, let's talk about your adventures in Ukraine. And so this is upcoming your third trip. Is that correct?
3 last year.
Okay. 3 last year and then
soon.
Okay. So can we talk a little bit about the origins of this? So what did you set out to do? And what was the thinking behind it? So I know that you've raised some money for something called Siobhan's Trust, which is around helping internally displaced persons. And you cycled, I think, initially from Odessa in the Black Sea to Chornobyl. Could you let's just go back right to the beginning. Where did this idea come from? And then we could dive into that first venture. But where did it all start?
Okay, so the date that we're talking now, Ben, it's been over 2 years since the invasion begun. And right from the start, I remember watching the news and being obviously affected, horrified, traumatized, despairing, sad, seeing all those images right at the start of that war and really wanting to somehow help. I very much had a lot of respect and admiration for the Ukrainians, just watching all the footage and their interviews. They seemed quite strong and resilient and still determined and smiling and laughing and going through hell. And I admired them a lot and just wanted to do something. How people these days feel a bit powerless or helpless with these horrendous situations going on. So for quite a while, I was looking for a way of helping. And I really wanted to physically be there, to have boots on the ground and to make eye contact, really, to touch our heart and souls together and to be there and show that I'm physically there and that I care and that they matter and have some solidarity and presence. So I managed to find a charity called Siobhan's Trust, as you mentioned. They're a Scottish charity. It's their 2-year anniversary today, actually, going out there. So really early days in the war. They drove out there and just immediately started to cook hot food for the for the queues of refugees at the border between Poland and Ukraine, which is a place called Medica. So they've been serving out there every single day for 2 years today. And their main easy thing that they do is they have great big lorries with pizza ovens. So they might have 5 or 6 gas-fired Gosney pizza ovens, and each oven holds 2 or 3 pizzas, and they cook after about a minute and a half. So we are literally cooking and serving 3,000 pizzas a day in a different location to IDPs and children and military and whoever's basically left. And they're so grateful and so happy to see us. It's not just about the pizza, Ben. It's about love and respect and hugs and music and smiles and laughter, and really just showing that people still care about them and that they haven't been forgotten. So that's what started it all. I heard about this and I thought, well, I can cook pizza. I'm not a chef by any means, but at least I can get out there physically, show my face, do some hugs and dance to some music and cook and serve pizza. So, I immediately signed up as soon as I heard about it. And I went out there in March last year and July last year. In the east of Ukraine, so around Zaporizhzhia and Kharkiv and Kherson and all those places that are so often on the news. And then a whole nother story, which we'll come on to. I then decided to cycle across from Odessa to Belarus, as you say, in support of this amazing charity who I really admired and respected. So it was to raise funds, to raise some press coverage and to raise some smiles as well with the locals as I cycled through the country.
Wow. So what were those first 2 visits like? What was involved? And you talk about some of those, some of those locations are the ones, as you say, that were in the news, right? So where there were bombings and, all types of negative, consequences and lost lives and, the war, right? War zones. And I'm just wondering what that was like. What went into, what did you find there? What did you expect? And what did it look like in some of these places?
Yeah, there's so much I could say, Ben. It was, because also the first visit was quite different from the second visit. I kind of got used to it by the second visit, but I remember the first one, booking my flights and committing, I felt nervous sitting at home for the 2 or 3 weeks before I left. It's not many people that offer to go out there, no military experience, no background to this sort of situation, never done humanitarian aid before, never been in a war zone before. And I was living in Hampshire and I'm middle-aged and all that. So I remember even just being quite nervous sitting at home and thinking, what on earth am I doing? And then my second moment I remember is crossing the border. So I flew in to Krakow in East Poland. You can't fly into Ukraine, so you fly as close as you can and then you have to go across land to get in there. I remember walking across the border and again suddenly feeling really nervous, because you enter Ukraine and it's been on the news. It's like, you see tanks and you see the Czech hedgehogs, which are those iron crosses in the roads, that you see on the news. And that the night before there had been, warnings of drones in the sky above Lviv, which is where I was going to initially. So suddenly it's so real. And I remember my stomach just feeling really kind of dropped out, thinking I'm in Ukraine now, and it had been on the television. Then, day by day, the second day I saw some bombed out buildings and I served a lady some pizza and she lived in the bombed out building. So that was a bit of a reality check as well. And that was in Borodyanka. And then I kept waiting for an air raid siren because there was a constant worry about air raid sirens and being hit by missiles. And I needed to lose my virginity, really. I needed to go through one and calm down. And I remember the first time the air raid siren went off about 5 days in, and I said, is that it? Is that it? And everyone's like, yeah. I said, do we go to shelter? And they said, well, you can if you like, but hardly anyone does go into the shelter unless we're definitely, getting aimed at. So that night I remember going to bed and looking out at the sky and thinking, what's out there? What's in the sky? Missiles, drones, fighter jets, stars. So you go through all these different sort of, I don't know what to call them, like stage gates where you learn and you experience different things, and then you get more hardened and more resilient, and you adapt more, and you learn to live with it more and more. So yeah, the second trip was so much easier. I was kind of quite relaxed going back. And in fact, I went back with two MPs. Ian Duncan Smith was one of them, and Rushanar Ali, who's a Labour MP. And it was a very different experience. But you learn to adapt, and you learn to live with these things as they had. And then I also remember the first time we had some incoming missiles. I was in a hotel in Kharkiv, and the air raid siren went off, but by then we were kind of used to it. But then there was actually the strong sound of an incoming missile, and we went to the shelter in the hotel, which is the basement of the hotel, to wait it out. And that was, 1 o'clock in the morning. They tend to strike at night because it sounds and feels worse, and it's more psychologically, damaging. So yeah, it's real. It's frightening, and you learn to live with it.
And you were doing humanitarian work, so you're making pizzas. What was a typical day like? What did you, from waking up to going to bed? What were you doing?
Well, partly expected it to be really harsh and difficult, but actually we don't normally leave until 10 o'clock in the morning, which is quite a luxury. And also we quite often stay in hotels because the hotels are empty, so they're quite cheap. So those were two positive elements that I wasn't expecting. But what happens is that a Ukrainian strategist gives us a pin location each night about 6 p.m. and that's our location for the next day. So we're not allowed to share that with the outside world. And normally we're on site for 10 o'clock or something. So we go to a different location each day. It tends to be an hour to 2 hours drive to the location. It might be a very quiet village, somewhere that's recently been occupied. It might be quite close to the front line, but we stay outside of artillery range. We were 10 miles from the Russian border at one point, east of Kharkiv. So we get in our vans, our trucks, and there might be 3, 4 or 5 trucks, and we travel in convoy with the red crosses on the trucks to show that we are part of humanitarian aid. The roads are mostly okay, but we pass kind of famous bridges and buildings that have been destroyed and we've seen on television. There's one bridge that featured quite a lot early on in the TV coverage where they were helping civilians across a muddy bit of water. And it's right there. And you kind of feel a bit like a tourist, which is weird. And you kind of explore that feeling as like, why do I feel like a tourist? And you obviously want to do and behave the right way, but that you can't help but feel it's quite surreal to experience it and see it for yourself firsthand. And then sometimes we have a police escort, at least meeting us towards the end to escort us into the site. It takes us about an hour to set up. So we've got maybe 5 to 15 volunteers, quite often about 8 volunteers from different countries. So people from Scandinavia or America, English, maybe Ukrainians as well, to be honest. And we set it all up and the pizzas are donated. So they're pre-made and packaged. So Ital Pizza and Dr. Oetker's Pizza, they've all been donated. Coca-Cola sometimes donate us bottles of Coca-Cola. We try and set up a tea station for hot tea and coffee and cacao. And in the summer, we've also done face painting for the kids if we've got enough staff. And then you're just mad. There's a queue of hundreds of people. By the time that you arrive, they all phone everyone else and say, hey, free pizza, come to the place. So we will serve thousands of people each day, and we just keep serving and keep smiling until the queue dies down. So we normally start at 10 and finish about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But as soon as people have had enough pizza, some of them have had maybe 4 or 5 or 6 pizzas and they've had enough. And then we clear up, leave no trace. And it's all delivered with respect and cheer and kindness and love and laughter and music. So that's a typical day, really.
Wow. And what did you get in terms of a sense of the Ukrainian people, in terms of what you saw, how they were dealing with what was happening? How did you get to speak to many Ukrainians? And what were some of the things, what were some of the messages you took away? How are they doing? Things of that nature, I think, would be interesting to get a better sense of.
Yeah, well, you're seeing mostly all the people that are still there, so there might be all the older people who just don't want to leave the country. So a lot of the older ladies and older men, babushkas, are particularly strong and amazing. Then you've got all the children, and there's surprisingly actually quite a lot of children still out there. So young families and children. And then now and again, you'll get the military turn up and want 100 or 200 pizzas to take back to their base. So it's mostly the people that are kind of left behind, and internally displaced. So they're living in horrendous conditions. And the impression that there's kind of a surface impression, which is, wow, they're smiling, they're grateful, and they're resilient. I know resilience is a word used a lot, but they truly are. They embody resilience. So they're queuing up. They're very grateful. They're polite. They thank us. They smile and laugh and dance with us. And they're very happy to see us. However, under the surface, there is a whole nother story, and that's trauma and tiredness and fatigue and despair. So, for instance, when you're serving and you make eye contact properly, you both end up crying, basically. Because underneath the resilience, there's, deep trauma. And because we've physically turned up and shown courage and kindness, you just have to make eye contact in a decent way, and you both start to well up because you both recognize why you're there. And also, if you hug people, I've hugged older women and children and soldiers, and they just don't let go. They're that lovely human contact and solidarity. They end up clinging to you, and it's really difficult to separate. I've been walking outside, and sometimes an older lady will stop and talk at me. They'll realize that I don't speak Ukrainian, and they're speaking Ukrainian. But again, eye contact and showing that you're listening, and they'll just talk. And I think they're just unburdening or sharing their story, and just nodding and making eye contact and looking as if you care is all it takes. And they are off, they're sharing whatever it is they're sharing. And also there was a young girl that asked for some dog food because she'd taken it upon herself to look after a lot of the stray dogs in that village, which happens a lot. And we always carry dog food in the lorries. So I said, yeah, come round the back and I'll give you some dog food. And I gave her a load, and she just hugged me and just cried and cried and cried and cried. And she couldn't let go. Just that little gesture, of giving her some dog food, and it all came out. So it's on the surface, resilient, amazing, looking after each other, grateful. Underneath, absolutely traumatized and fatigued and despairing.
Wow. It's hard to imagine when you talk about dog food, right? And I have my little dog running right behind me, and these are things that are everyone's daily lives, and how disrupted and traumatized everything must have gotten or must be. It gives you a really good sense of what they're going through. So, appreciate that description. Can we take a step back and then talk about your decision to do this cycle journey? Where did that come from? How did you go from these trips to then saying, yeah, I want to cycle 400 miles from the Black Sea to the Belarusian border? How did that come about?
So I think this is where risk becomes fascinating, because in a way, before I explain some of the details, in a way you could just say, what a crazy or stupid thing to do. To cycle, doesn't even matter. I was going to say female. It doesn't even matter that I'm female, but just to cycle across a war zone country sounds stupid or crazy and too risky or selfish or wrong, all sorts. But actually, it's where this lovely risk awareness and risk management really gets juicy and kicks in. So basically, I've already cycled across 16 countries. I've got experience cycling across a country. I kind of know what I'm doing now. I've got it off pat. I've got a routine. I've got discipline. I've got kit. I'm used to it. I've got it nailed. I'd also been working in Ukraine, right? A couple of months altogether, but getting very familiar with the country and the people. And I could see locals cycling, as people do, cycling to the shops, carrier bags of fruit and vegetables on their handlebars. So when I got back from the July trip, I was sitting on my sofa having a cup of tea and reflecting. And I thought, well, I was due to cycle across some more countries anyway, which I always do for charity. I've been doing it for UNICEF. And I'd obviously just come back from Ukraine. So I thought, well, why can't I actually cycle across Ukraine and obviously do it for charity, for Siobhan's trust, and hopefully raise some media coverage, because the subject was dropping off the headlines by late last year. Other things were taking precedent in the papers. And also, with my respect for the Ukrainians, to actually do some more, respect and smiles and kindness and solidarity while I was there. So the seed was born or sown, and once I'd had the thought, I couldn't really get rid of it, because it sounded crazy to me. But once I thought I could do it, then I was committed, really. So I phoned a friend up, Neil Lawton. He's an adventurer, and he'd also been out to Ukraine volunteering with Siobhan's Trust. Top bloke, ex-SAS, really knows what he's doing. He's led lots of expeditions, and he's a cyclist. And I said, Neil, do you fancy cycling across Ukraine with me? And he said, yeah, sure. And I think it was sort of so easy, because we both knew what we were doing. We knew what we were about. We knew we're courageous and capable, experienced, adventurous and cyclists. We'd both been to Ukraine. So although it sounds like a quick, spontaneous idea and response, Neil and I both know what we're made of, So he then managed to get hold of a support truck, Wild Box Adventure Vehicles. So a lovely gentleman called Mark Cropley owns the company, and he offered to support us with his Mercedes Sprinter. And that was it. That was us going out. So then it was a lot of planning, getting the kit and the sponsorship, bit of money, logistics, authority, all that sensible pre-trip planning, which took about a month. And then we flew out and drove to Odessa, which took 14 hours to get down to Odessa after about 1 hour's sleep, and headed north. Talking of risk, Ben, I listed all the risks. To do, you do a proper risk analysis, risk assessment, risk management, risk awareness. There was about 30 things that were on the risk list. But we mitigated and managed them all. And it is fascinating because, as you say, you would think this was completely bonkers and off the scale when it came to making decisions. But actually, I think it was a really well risk managed challenge with so much return on investment that it was completely worth it.
Well, can we talk a little bit about that? Some of the things that were kind of the top of that list. And you described this adventure, you described what others might initially say about it. And one of the first words you mentioned was selfish. And I'm just thinking about this is a country in a war. And now you've got these, you're a foreigner, who's doing this adventure thing. And does that put extra stress? I'm thinking about the extra stress on the infrastructure there. I'm thinking the parallel I'm thinking about is when we were told during COVID not to stray too far from our homes because, I'm a cyclist and I like to go on big, long bike rides. And we were told, don't go out that far because if you get into an accident and they have to call an ambulance, you're putting strain on the healthcare system. But here you guys are going, as foreigners cycling. And so I'm just wondering, first of all, how you dealt with that. Was that on top of your list? I'm presuming everything was all self-sufficient, but maybe we could start there and then talk about some of the other challenges that you highlighted before you went.
Yeah, I'm just being honest, Ben, that 99% of the people I spoke to said, good on you, girl, go for it. And one or two said, literally one person talked about questioned whether it was selfish, and another said charity begins at home. And
yeah,
so on the selfish point, we were a very capable team. We were self-sufficient. Yeah. One of the reasons to have a support van was in case of something happening. We had medical kit, support van. We had our own accommodation with us, in effect. We were completely respectful of local legalities and procedures and people and time. And if an accident had happened, it would have been like anyone in that country having an accident, to be honest. The amount of volunteers that are out there trying to help, or the public or the military, we all perhaps now and again need an ambulance if there's a road traffic accident. So that's kind of normal. Don't want to add to that, to the weight, the burden of the system, as you said, during NHS. And the lockdown, we're advised not to do anything stupid. So we were aware of that and informed of that, but we really didn't think we were adding ridiculous burden, because we were self-sufficient and we'd done a lot of research and we're very capable. And then on the other side of that scale was the amount of encouragement, inspiration, smiles, laughter, hope, strength that we generated from doing what we did.
Yeah.
And, I've worked in the RNLI and I've done survival courses. And I know sometimes it just takes an odd person to do something heroic or crazy or against the odds to make actually quite a big positive difference, and to role model that life can be okay, or life can be fun, or life can be courageous despite everything that's going on. So I think it was a balanced, considered decision. And I'm willing to stand up to anyone who would challenge the selfishness of it. It certainly either wasn't for my own brand or marketing. I know we're talking about it now on the podcast, but my own glory was definitely not part of the equation either. I'm 100% was doing it for all the right reasons.
Yeah, you have enough Palmaras on your bucket list anyway to need yet another thing. So then the other thing that is obvious to me is the sort of security aspects, the route that you were taking, and I guess presumably there was a whole range of security considerations that you needed to think about, and I'm just wondering if you could maybe talk us through that.
Yeah, it wasn't as formal as perhaps you'd imagine. I get asked this a lot, and people assume there's a lot of formality, but it's quite a fluid situation. So fluid daily decision making with respect was kind of how we played it. We took some paperwork to explain what we were doing and why, and that was translated into Polish and Ukrainian as well. And I carried that on me at all times. The communications and internet are working most of the time out there. So we were constant contact with each other and and we had other people aware of where we were and what we were doing. So WhatsApp messages, quite straightforward, really, and communications we kept as necessary. The fact that Neil Lawton, my supporter, was ex-SAS, he really knew what he was doing from an expedition and SAS point of view. So he was very good at being operationally below the radar, shall we say, and doing things through caution. I probably cycled through about 40 checkpoints, and I've done it before with the previous work out there, so I knew what to expect. You don't take photos, you give them respect. So I used to cycle up to a checkpoint, lift up my sunglasses so they could see my eyes, smile at them, have my paperwork ready, be prepared to stop. Quite often they would just wave me through with a smile. Sometimes I'd stop. Sometimes I'd have a chat. You know, what you doing? And I'm like, cycling across your country. They're like, you're crazy. And I'm like, yeah. So that sort of thing. So we had people locally who were aware of where we were and what we're doing. We had the paperwork. We had respect for local conditions. We had a fluid system, and we had the SAS guy making sure that we didn't do anything stupid with our camping and where we were going and all that. Most of the country, of course, is kind of operating as per normal. There's obviously a chunk of land now that is under Russian occupation, but we were cycling, if you can imagine, that line literally north, directly north of Odessa, straight up really through, well, just west of Kyiv, up to Belarus. So it's more or less a straight line, not in Russian artillery range, but certainly in the range of missiles or drones or bombs. But that was the same as being out there, you know, doing humanitarian aid. So that hadn't really changed. So yeah, that's the sorts of things we did to manage the sort of security aspect. The other interesting element was towards the top, towards the north, we were not only heading towards the Chornobyl exclusion zone, but also Belarus, which was a potentially hostile border. And this was back in October last year when, I don't know if your listeners will remember, but the Wagner group were potentially being, well, we don't know where they were, but Belarus was in the picture a bit. So we had to be a little bit more circumspect and cautious heading north. But again, we were in touch with local authorities, and we just did what we were told and stuck to the road that we were allowed to go on, and stopped where we were told to stop.
Okay. And you mentioned you drove, was it 14 hours to Odessa? So was it the same idea that you flew into Poland and then drove down to Odessa? Is that how it worked?
Yeah. So we had some lovely support by some local businessmen from the UK who, two of them drove the van out and met us at Krakow airport, and another two flew out and drove the van back for us. So the three of us on the expedition, we flew into Krakow, picked up the van, and then it's about 2 or 3 hours to the border at Medica. We went through there at about 3 a.m. So it took a couple of hours. It's quite a slow border, lots of lorries and people waiting to get through. And then we just pulled over the other side, away from all the crap that the lorry drivers managed to put around, and had an hour's sleep, and then drove that 14 hours down to Odessa, where we camped in a location that we felt was as safe as possible, because Odessa was a bit of a hot spot. And it was the time of all the grain lorries and ships being bombed and the ports being bombed. So we camped slightly out of Odessa, kept an eye out on local activity, of course. You've got an air raid siren alert on your mobile phone on an app. And then I arranged to meet a local cyclist the next day in Odessa who cycled us back out through Odessa as we headed north. So, you know, we did everything we could to stay safe and responsible.
And did you camp most of the time when you slept?
Because I was cycling most of the time, Neil tended to look out for a decent spot to camp. And again, using his military background, he knew exactly what to look for and what was the best places to go. That was just, next to a farmer's field or under some trees near a wood or something. Obviously looking out for any mine tape, because they put tape up to say beware of any mines. And we camped every night. Quite enjoyed it, actually. The end of a long day cycling, and it was quite hot, so we'd sit outside, have something to eat from the local garage, have a chat, maybe have a bit of wine. So quite civilized, really. And then we managed to serve pizzas. So we met up with Siobhan's Trust, the charity, twice en route. So we served pizzas in Oman and an orphanage near Lviv. And we also went into Kiev to meet up with some MPs, and Charles Moore, the journalist, and he interviewed us. And we also went to a place called Makariv, which had been occupied. There was a battle of Makariv at the start of the war when they first tried to enter Kiev, and they were occupied for months. So we talked to some locals there and heard their stories, which were bloody awful, to be honest. So we had quite a lot of experiences as well as the actual cycling en route.
So the whole journey was about 400 miles. So you were doing about 100 kilometers a day. So something, was that correct? So maybe something along those lines, 80 miles, something along those lines each day. So how long did to
be honest, the cycling bit was quite easy.
Yeah.
I can't take much credit for the cycling bit, to be honest. I quite enjoyed it. Rolling hills, and I was only really doing about 60, 70 miles a day. I normally do more, but it was everything else that made it more tiring, if you like, because of the checkpoints and the camping and, just being hyper vigilant. Listening to some of the stories, even, whenever we stopped, and seeing the devastation and listening to the stories. So, and we went into Bucha and Irpin, some pretty horrendous places. So the cycling bit was easy. It kind of only took me about 6 days, but then we strung it out by filming some local people about their mental health and chatting to locals and, trying to generate the press coverage and all that. So it was about 460 miles, easily done, very hot. There was one day when I did cycle about 12 hours with the back brake stuck on my back wheel, which wasn't the best day, but I can't complain compared to what the locals are going through.
Could you maybe talk to us a little bit about maybe one or two of the stories that or things that you were told, or things that you came across? Maybe is there a day or a moment that or two that stick out along the journey?
Yeah, I think the one I've just sort of personally referred to. So Makariv, it's, I'd never heard of Makariv, which is, I don't know, I feel bad because it's definitely gone through quite a lot of, Russian bombing and occupation, but it was a name and a town that I've never heard of before we left. So it was just chance that we chose it for that night's rest stop. So it was a long day, really hot. And as I say, my back brake was sticking. The support guys went ahead of me quite often. So I was quite often just cycling quite happily on my own. And I just remember my chain coming off my bike. So I had to keep stopping to put the chain back on and get really oily and dirty. The back wheel wasn't going round quite as nicely as usual, so it was a bit more work. There was a few hills. I was really hot. It was a Sunday and it was a long day. So by the end of the day, I was really quite grumpy. Meanwhile, the support van went ahead and they were sending me messages saying, oh, there's a party here. And they were sending me photos of them kind of drinking champagne, saying, we're waiting for you. And it made me even crosser because I was hot and sweaty and dirty and tired, and my support men were having a party. So I arrived in Makariv, and sure enough, there was about 9 ladies there having a birthday party in a restaurant. And they were beautiful, young. They were 23 years old. they all met through going to the gym in the village, and they had, hair and nails and dresses and high heels, and they were drinking vodka and champagne and having some food. And they loved the fact that 3 English people had gate crashed their party. So it was all lovely atmosphere. But then we all began to realize that it was a place of past historic bombing, destruction, devastation, murder, rape, tanks, missiles, fires. So these girls were determined to carry on going to the gym and carry on celebrating each other's birthdays. But between them, they had horrendous stories and experiences. And it was their way to show that life goes on. And it was almost a contract between them to be there for each other, to celebrate a birthday no matter what, to have some normality by putting on a dress and some, do their hair sometimes and so on. But they showed us videos and photographs from the past, and they had friends who had been murdered and raped. 40% of their town had been destroyed. They'd been occupied by Russians for over a month. And they've made a film about it, which is incredible. But again, it's that below the surface, you might turn up and think everything's fine. But then you look around and you see the destruction and the shrapnel and the glass, that has been blown out of every building. And there's an old tank, burnt out at the side of the road. And these girls who are beautiful and 23 years old, trying to just cope. And one of them was a teacher, and she said, we teach the whole school in 2 shifts because the bomb shelter isn't big enough to house all the children. So the children have to either go to school in the morning or they go to school in the afternoon. And often, of course, they're having to go down into the bomb shelter. So it's things like this, and it's there. And I'm so glad that we experienced that, because otherwise you're cycling through these places and you've got no idea of the stories, as you say, the actual stories of what's going on and what people are going through. So I'm kind of glad that we ended up in Makariv, even though it was a day that I was feeling really tired and cross and hot. And then, of course, as soon as you hear all this stuff, it gives you such a sense of perspective and puts everything back in its place.
Yeah, it definitely puts everything back in its place and makes it all seem rather trivial. I guess if your back brake is rubbing or the chain falling off isn't all that material when you think about it, isn't it? That's quite interesting. Just as a psychologist, what did you take away from? You talk a lot about the mental health, and I think the charity that Siobhan's Trust also deals with mental health. And I'm just wondering what you took away from listening to people, Ukrainians, who've been going through trauma, and what do you take away from that as a psychologist? It's maybe a perspective that a non-psychologist maybe might not think about.
I think one of the surprising things is just the tiredness, the fatigue. So you expect and assume there's going to be trauma and tears and anger, but they're tired. It's been 2 years of mental and physical strain, and they're not sleeping very well. You can imagine they're getting, air raid sirens going off most nights, and that constant threat of what might happen to them and their village, but also if they've got a man on the front line, that constant worry about their safety. So I think one of the surprises and one of the things that I hadn't really anticipated is just they're really tired. They're fatigued. So it's all great being resilient. It's impressive and inspirational and amazing. And when you see them singing in the church or going to the shops and carrying carrier bags of heavy potatoes home, or, the children having their faces painted, you think, brilliant. but they're so tired. And that's, I think, a bit that we don't really appreciate. They're not getting enough sleep. And of course, that adds its own stress and inability to cope sometimes. So there's that. And also there's some disturbing ways that affecting, like, some anger, deep anger. And you wonder, what the children and the teenagers are going to grow up like and what they're going to think and feel when they're older, because there's huge anger towards, let's say, the Russians, for want of a better description. So that's quite rightly, I suppose, quite a hard emotion. And some of the PTSD, they've seen some pretty horrendous things. So there was a gentleman that came back from fighting, and the family dog jumped on the bed, as part of being just a normal dog. And he went to kill the dog because he was so traumatized. So there's some shocking, deep trauma as well, which again, perhaps we don't imagine or can't imagine if we haven't been there. So yeah, the tiredness, the anger and the PTSD. I've experienced some kind of hypervigilance where I was driving in the rain and some of the raindrops on my windscreen I thought were drones. So that's crazy because I've never experienced that before. And just to think that some raindrops out of the corner of your eye make you look twice and wonder what that thing is. So it's quite interesting to actually experience some of these things, albeit very gently, to be honest. So it's also going to be interesting, I think, to see the future. So Madam Zelensky is campaigning for mental health and just everyday mental health, which I think is very wise. It's just the daily simple things that they can do to stay sane. And maybe later on the programs of therapy and, psychiatry will come in. But for now, it's just about making some borscht, seeing a friend down the road, hugging a dog, rescuing a cat, picking some sunflowers, everyday mental health, which I think is very practical right now. But then in the future, they're going to need a whole ton of rebuilding the country physically and rebuilding some generations, especially, mentally.
Yeah, that's an interesting take on it. And I'm actually thinking about other conflicts that, and the, as you describe that, and I think you make a very important point about what will happen to you mental health wise, what will happen with young people, how they're going to grow up, because untreated, this has all types of follow-on consequences. And you could almost even say, perhaps, historical patterns exist because of, there's probably some theory out there about some untreated trauma. And I think you make a very interesting point about rebuilding a country, not just the physical infrastructure, but the mental health of the population. I think that's a very interesting point that one doesn't hear that much about.
Yeah, I think two things. One is so much focus is on the physical. I mean, in life too, which is why I'm fascinated by psychology. With risk, we always think about the physical things that could go wrong. What about the risk of mental health, and psychological safety and all that? So I think typically we always revert to physical when we're preparing or training or buying stuff. But there's definitely a mental risk, of course. But I'd also like to say there's, on a positive point, I do worry about, the kids and the teenagers and the people that go through it. But on a positive note, the kids are being amazing. They're not doing too badly. They're so adaptable. They are and you could even see that as a bad thing because they're adapting to the war, but they are being incredibly adaptable. And I do think that every act of kindness, like with Siobhan's Trust, just serving, 3,000 pizzas a day, but every act of kindness that they witness and every foreigner who comes into their country who helps them, I hope will give them a point of reference so that they don't all turn poisoned, or they're not too traumatized or poisoned by what they're experiencing, but there's also strength and hope and kindness in the world. And I do think also when this is over, that so many countries will pile in to help. And that will also bolster them for, I don't know, feeling loved and looked after a bit in the future. But for now, it's still going on, of course, and, horrendous conditions, but a lot of bravery and kindness and small acts of resilience and inspiration going on all over the country.
You finished the journey in Chernobyl. Could you talk a little bit about that? What was the situation near the border with Belarus? How different was that to the rest of what you saw?
It's quite amusing in a way, being on a podcast about risk whilst in a nuclear zone and a war zone.
It's appropriate.
And it did make us have hysterics that last night, because, sometimes if you're maybe on a challenge or an adventure or in church or in school, and you just get hysteria sometimes because things have just gone so far, and it's a release, isn't it, of tension or something. But it was crazy that last night. We were camping by what looked like a radioactive pond. It was oozing slime and like giant frogs, and and we knew we were near the border and there was military maneuvers going on around us. So it was ridiculously crazy. But again, I think we were relatively safe because, we'd done our risk assessment and analysis and we were very situationally aware, but it was kind of funny. So as we went north, the roads got quieter and quieter because there's less civilian traffic. There's obviously not so many towns and cities for people to be driving to and from. And basically you're heading towards a dead end. So the normal traffic, quite often larders, the little larders that are everywhere, that all died away. And it was just quite often me and sometimes a military run of vehicles going past. And I felt a bit weird, but they didn't take any notice of me. A couple of times I cycled past camouflage netting and I looked back and it was a tank in disguise at the side of the road. So it got a bit eerie, I think is the right word, and less normality and more military maneuvers or secretive, trenches or dugouts or camps. So it began to feel a little bit more spooky, and I felt a little bit more self-conscious, but more respectful and aware of my environment and making sure that I didn't do anything stupid. So the roads were lovely. It was through forest and smooth, flat roads. So the cycling itself was very enjoyable. And then we weren't sure how far we'd be allowed to go north because of the military operations and the context. So we were constantly in touch with one lady who was in charge of the Chornobyl exclusion zone, as in, would we be allowed into that area? And another lady who was in charge of the military borders. So they were both messaging me with a lot of respect and love. And between the three sort of parties, us, the border and Chernobyl, we all managed to be happy with the road that we took and where we would stop. Okay. So we camped that night, got hysterics about where we were and what we were doing. A cowherd gentleman came up to us and we gave him a beer and he kissed my hand for being so amazing and inspirational and doing what I was doing for his country. That's a typical interaction. Absolutely lovely. Sun was setting. The cows were, grazing with their bells ringing. And this lovely local gentleman who looked after the herd took a beer off us and kissed my hand. This is typical. So then we went to sleep with hysterics, still giggling and being ridiculous about if we got bitten by a mosquito, would we die of nuclear reaction poisoning or would we turn into Spider-Man or something? And then with the messages from the local support, we knew exactly which road to take, went through past a training camp, through quite a major checkpoint. And then as we approached, we could see a kind of temporary border with all the usual paraphernalia up there and the sentry boxes and dogs and lots of military. So we pulled up there, had a chat. They let us take some photos, amazingly, and then that was it. That was the end of the challenge. So turned around and put my feet up.
Right. Yeah, that sounds so surreal as well. Like, the lady who was in charge of the Chernobyl exclusion zone and the mosquito that, that could be radioactive, which I guess would turn you into Mosquito Woman, as opposed to Spider-Man, but we digress. Really interesting adventure. And so you're going back. Could you talk to us a little bit about what you're going to be doing this time around?
Yeah, sure. The cycle was a one-off, and I'm really glad I did it. And I will carry on cycling across other countries. I've said I'll do 50, so I've now done 17, and I'm looking to cycle across Denmark, Austria, Germany, and somewhere else, maybe Czech Republic this year. And then I'm back to Ukraine, flying out on the 1st of April. So maybe once this podcast has been released, I would have gone. I don't know. And doing what I do, which is fly into Krakow, catch the overnight train across with the sleeper carriages, and you sit in your little bunk bed all underneath all the sheets and blankets and have a cup of tea or coffee off the train concierge lady quite often, and then go and serve pizzas. So I'm looking forward to seeing some of the volunteers are the same people that have been out there for months, and I'm quite good at cooking pizza now. I can cook 850 in one day, and it's kind of very pleasing. I mean, it obviously feels good to be able to help, but just to do something so simple and forget about the busyness of the rest of the world for a bit, just cooking and serving pizzas, it's very, very pleasing, and obviously very heartwarming to be out there and to know that you're doing your bit. So when I come back, I always feel quite, I feel happier and healthier, weirdly, than when I left. So that'll be out there for about 3 weeks.
Fantastic. That sounds great. So you mentioned this charity. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about it, and also for my listeners who they're listening to you and they think, oh, I'd like to do something to help. How could they do that? How could they help?
Yeah, I mean, we'd love more volunteers. It's hard to find them, of course, because it takes a bit of balls to go out there, but no skill required. So anyone who's feeling like they could, then obviously get in touch with me. I'm really happy to talk it through and explain what to expect and what they would go through, or even go with them potentially. So all volunteers would be great. They've had 312 people volunteer so far, I heard today, and we've served 1.5 million pizzas so far. Interestingly, today the charity has relaunched a bit, and it's been separated out from the original charity to a certain extent. So Siobhan's Trust is the original charity, originally set up to really serve the people of Scotland. Branch was a amazing reaction at the start of the war to just go out there and help, bring some hot food and cheer to the IDPs. But it's been 2 years now, so we're separating a bit, and Siobhan's Trust will carry on serving the people of Scotland and other disaster aid relief. Meanwhile, the pizza operation in Ukraine is called HopeFull, so Full. And I would need to look up, or maybe we could put it in your notes, Ben, because this was literally launched today. And I'm not sure of the website ending, whether it's org UK, but I'd need to look up the website. But maybe for now, if we can say verbally, get in touch with me in the first instance, and then I can redirect anyone who inquires, and maybe we could put it in your notes, the link to it. And also the cycle, that's through Just Giving. So Paula Reid, REID, Just Giving, Crane or Siobhan's Trust will get people to that. Or again, just get in touch with me. So paulareid.com or paula@paulareid.com would be great. And then I can either direct, hopefully, for donations or volunteers or whatever.
Yeah, we'll definitely put all those things in the show notes. So we'll make sure we do that. We certainly covered a lot of ground, and we touched on adventure psychology and your time in the Ukraine. But was there anything that you wanted to cover that you don't think we got a chance to yet?
There's just so much, isn't there? There's layers to this and more details, but I think we've had a good conversation about the right sort of things. But, you know, there's the two sides of the psychology in the way, isn't there? And we definitely also feel a lot of sympathy for the Russian soldiers too, of course. You know, it's awful for everyone involved. So if you think about the psychology of people, I'm not going to start going into the psychology of Putin right now, because that would be a whole nother podcast. But it's kind of fascinating. But I think just to continue to talk about hope, and that even though anyone listening, if they do feel like overwhelmed or useless or unable to contribute something positive to these horrendous situations, there's always something. There's, you know, it can be a small thing, but that's okay. Reading the press and the media or listening to the 10 o'clock news, we can despair and feel incapable of achieving anything, but we can help. We can be agentic. It could literally be serving pizzas or sending a note to someone you know who's in trouble, or sending a bit of money. Anything, you know, we can all do a bit, and not to feel overwhelmed by the media and the messages, because if it bleeds, it leads, right? So much of the media coverage is negative, because that's what media coverage quite often does. Plus, we've got a negativity bias of 3-1 at least. So we always take on board and heed negative messages more than positive ones. But I do feel that any small act of kindness or support or help is great. And people, I think, should not despair, but be hopeful and helpful in any way they can.
That's great. I did have one, as you were talking about, one further question or maybe area to just touch on is, how has your experiences in Ukraine, how have they changed you as an adventurer or as a person? Do you look at things a little bit differently or a lot differently? If so, how?
I think that listening to my own messages back at me just now, I think I at least did something that felt useful and was a small action that must make a dent in some of the horrendous situation that's going on. Every person that I see, every person that I hug, every child's face that I've painted, every person I waved at when I was cycling through you know, all good, right? The ripple effect is great. So I need to listen to that myself and know that my action has had lots of micro positive reactions, I suppose. But also, I'm quite pleased that I've made myself do this. I just still remember sitting at home the first time I booked my flights, thinking, you know, genuinely thinking, quite nervous, scared, anxious. And yeah, you know, I did it. So, I'm really proud that I have done these things. And I think once again proven to myself, if you don't mind me saying, that with some of the adventures I've done, and this is added to my sense of being strong-minded and useful and on the right track, not wasting too much life, just in self-indulging and eating chocolate and drinking wine, but actually this feels good, it feels right. And I think I'll carry on being quite a Ukrainian supporter for quite a few years yet. I can feel it in my blood. So, and I think it's given me even more respect and appreciation for what people go through, because it's all well and good sitting somewhere safe and comfortable and saying, oh, you should do this and you should do that. But until you actually see it or feel it, you don't really, really know what it's like to have your family dog jump up on your bed and be scared of that. You know, so I think it's also opened my eyes and made me more appreciative of other people's experiences that aren't mine, and I need to have more respect for that.
Paul, I love that.
This feels like therapy now,
also,
Ben.
Yeah, no. Well, it's a little bit like that, right? But I think you raise an important point because I've actually just co-written a book called Decision Making in the Poly-Crisis Era. And I'm sort of rereading some of the sections of the book, talking about the book. And it's very, very easy to despair, right? Because, there's all this stuff, climate change and geopolitics and war and all kinds of things. Very easy to despair. But I think you offer a way of, I wouldn't say it's not a solution because all these problems are really complex, but a start in many ways in that, because you've identified and you've done and you lived something that one can do. Right. And as you talk about the ripple effects and if that inspires other people to do the same, I think that's quite important. And so I thank you for that. And similarly, do you think you raised a very important point about the sort of the mental health aspects of conflict and of trauma, and it's the Greeks say that history is a cycle, and you do wonder how much of what's gone on before, how much of that influences history because of unhealed trauma amongst leaders, amongst people, and whether or not, we can at least start to put a little bit of a dent in all of that as human beings. So I think that's another thing I took away from the conversation. So, thank you for those things. That's great. I think this is going to resonate very, very well with my listeners. But I think I think that's perhaps a good place to wrap things up. So thank you very much for your time, and really appreciate this.
And thanks for hosting, Ben, and having you back on, but for giving me the airtime to be able to talk about these things. And obviously all the best with your decisive future.
Thank you.